Tonight we welcome you all to the Hamilton Broadmeadow Uniting Church and this the Wesley Church site. In the past, the congregation based here has been known for its political awareness and involvement in social action and community development. One of our past ministers, the Reverend John Mason, was a former opposition leader in the state parliament, and members here have been at the forefront in community actions about supporting people of different cultural backgrounds and welcoming refugees. Tonight we are commencing the first of what we hope to be a series of conversations about the values and ethics that shape lives of civic service and community contribution. It is our hope to encourage and stimulate thinking about how we can do our best as a community and how we can encourage our community leaders to do their best. The series will not be limited to politicians, but we'll start with our local members as the most public faces in our community. Tonight, you will have an opportunity to pose some questions, but we ask that you do so by writing them down for our conversation partner to pose. During a brief break, we would invite you to write down any questions you may have. Amelia, our interviewer tonight, has a background in creative arts and is currently undertaking a doctorate in intercultural studies. Having worked as an opera singer, teacher, taxi driver, youth worker, community educator and minister, Amelia is aware of the diversity that makes up our local community and believes the church exists to bless and support the wider world around us. Amelia is excited about the new possibilities that open up as different interest groups within the community learn to listen to each other and work together. I will now invite one of our Bridge founders, Hamish Mackenzie, to introduce our special guest. But just before I do, I'd like to ask everyone to turn off their mobile phones or put them on silent, please.
Thanks, Leonie. Is that okay? I'm Hamish Mackenzie. Of the privilege of introducing Sharon tonight. I know Sharon privately, I suppose, or publicly, but it is an honour to introduce you tonight. Sharon was elected as the federal member for Newcastle in September 2013, becoming just the 6th member of Newcastle in the federal parliament since federation in 1901. Sharon's a 5th generation Novocastrian with more than 15 years experience working in her local community. After graduating from Lambton High School, where she was also school captain, Sharon completed an honours degree in anthropology and for 4 years worked in remote Aboriginal communities in the Kimberley near Fitzroy Crossing in Western Australia, especially with the Boonabah people, but more generally with the community-based disability services sector. I think that's roughly it, but you might like to, it'd be nice if you talk more about it. Some of her work was writing submissions to obtain funds to buy cattle stations, which were to be run by the Aboriginal community themselves. She also worked as a Jillaroo on a huge cattle property in the Northern Territory in the hot sun, hundreds of kilometres from anywhere. It was about this time that she developed a program for herself of drinking beer copiously and frequently. My wife told me not to use that joke, but I couldn't help myself. Sharon is a strong advocate for social justice, democracy and equality, and is driven by her conviction that everyone deserves a fair go. As a federal member, Sharon tries to ensure Newcastle is included in the national debate on as many issues as possible. Before entering federal parliament, Sharon was an active councillor on the Newcastle City Council, where she was very involved in so many local issues, including a magnificent children's playground in Islington Park, which is very close to my house. No matter what or how many, all the other things that you have done for this alone, my grandchildren, thank you profoundly and abundantly. So I present Sharon Claydon. Thanks.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening and welcome to everybody, and welcome, Sharon. It's a privilege to have you here with us tonight.
Thank you for the invitation. I feel very honoured to be here. Thanks.
During the course of the evening, we're going to have, first of all, a conversation and then invite people to write down questions, and there's a bowl up the back that people can put them in, and after that we'll come back and respond to some of those. But first of all, just to get us into the swing of things, you're a fifth generation Novocastrian. I'm only a beginner. I only moved here a couple of years ago. So what makes a Novocastrian? What influences have there been, particularly growing up here, being part of a family that's been long-term here? Tell us a bit about your background.
Look, you know, it makes me really feel at home, and I'm not quite sure how else I might describe it. I am a fifth generation Novocastrian. You know, my mother's here at the moment. I have a long history and association to this region. And it just means that I have, you know, fantastic family and lived experiences to draw on, and understanding my community. I guess the trials and tribulations over time, and of course the triumphs and resilience of this community, which always just inspires me no end. So I should say that, you know, there were times my father was in the Defence Forces when I was very young, so that meant that we did get posted around. So in my early days, I lived in Darwin for a period of time, and in the Holsworthy camp before my father was sent to Vietnam. So that was an interesting experience. I just had spent some time with some defence personnel recently, and we were comparing notes on Holsworthy marriage quarters these days. And I just remember, you know, Holsworthy was very much just a public school, but it was completely an army school, because the only people that lived in that area were army kids, really. And I didn't appreciate it, of course, as a child, but there were, you know, really significant periods of time where I would go to school and there was just a generation of fathers that were absent from our community. And there were lots of, you know, mums like mine who were, you know, living, raising kids. You know, my mum was holding down a job, husband overseas in a war zone, and us two kids raising us. So plenty of women were doing that, and I remember thinking, you know, she was a bit sort of short-tempered that year, but I didn't quite register that there might have been a few additional pressures in her life, of course, until older. So I did have a bit of period away, but in all that time that we were moving around with the army, my parents had always said, you know, we will be going home. And like, I always knew what home was and where that was. So this was Newcastle. So, you know, I used to, in that period, get to come up here for holidays and, you know, live with family friends who had a, you know, fantastic big family. And I just thought it was great coming back to Newcastle for holidays. And then, but of course, you know, I was fortunate. I was back in time to do all my high schooling here. So Lambton High was my old high school. And I was really thrilled. The first school I got to visit after being elected as a federal member, I got to go back to my old high school and do the investiture of prefects.
So what's the school motto?
Light the way.
Light the way. Oh, perfect.
So we were a very young school. It was only built in the 70s, so no Latin mottos. And
That's great.
it was, I would have been maybe only the second cohort to go through from year 7 through to year 12. So it was a new young school in Newcastle, full of promise. And again, I didn't appreciate the time, but perhaps with your background in arts, Amelia, you might appreciate, for a state school, it had this incredibly strong artistic tradition. And so we had printing presses and etching presses at a school in the 1970s in a public school, which, again, I took for granted at the time, but was a really unique kind of feature. So I had a really fabulous grounding with great teachers in the visual arts, which has become a lifelong passion for me too.
And they're quite shaping things, communications, and so the Light the Way motto, has that cropped up at other times for you then?
Yeah, it has. It's I am sure we didn't have a school song when I was there, because I certainly don't remember it, but I've sat and listened. They've actually developed a song called Light the Way now, and I've seen it performed a couple of times now, and I've had an opportunity to reflect on that and what it meant to me. And I guess it was an attempt to instill a capacity within each and every one of us. That's my reading of my school motto anyway, in years gone by. But it's a capacity and a responsibility as well to actually always attempt to light a way.
Right. So becoming a school captain is kind of one of those first things that one does representative of a student body, really. So you started that kind of civic service even when at school. Do you remember what the promptings were?
It gets worse. I was captain in primary school too.
As well.
So it's got to be my family, is what I say. It did start very young. I grew up in a family that was active in the community. Mm-hmm. Even when we lived in different communities, they were very quick to become involved in communities that they lived in. So it wasn't an option in my household to come home and, have a whinge about something, because my father would just look me straight in the eye and just say, so what are you going to do about that? And the challenge was always back to you. And so I felt early on that, I did feel empowered about having some capacity to act, and that is something that has remained with me for life. I do have this very strong belief in human agency and being able to, make a difference. So I remained very optimistic in that regard too.
So in what ways did those two experiences then at schools help you to feel that you had that capacity to act?
I had a very strong, nurturing family that led by example. I had good supports within those school bodies, I think, to, both good support from my peers as well as my teachers, who, I didn't ever feel like you couldn't, that you couldn't push boundaries, that you couldn't question, that you couldn't, I was encouraged to do those things. And I'm very grateful for that. I think they're quite good skills to have in life.
So when you finished school then, did you go straight off to university and study?
But it was a checkered period too.
Okay.
So I did go to university. I was 17 when I left home, and I I went to Sydney to go to university because Newcastle University was still quite a young university, and I was looking at doing a combination of law and anthropology, neither of which were on offer at that time at Newcastle. So going to Sydney, and I've got to confess at 17, the idea of, hitting the big city was probably quite attractive. I stayed, this is my connection with Wesley, I lived at Wesley College on campus at the University of Sydney. So that was when I first started to have an understanding of a Wesley tradition. And that was, a really phenomenal experience as well. I remember being slightly scared, thinking, wow, it had a very structured kind of extra-tutorial system in operation.
And a very strong justice orientation.
Oh, I had, Keith Suter was my live-in tutor at the time. Wow. And he was the only man I'd known at the time that held a double PhD, which sounded a bit scary. And I remember, but he was so, he was my tutor in government. Right. And I remember going, I was 17, first year at uni, and we had to do a government sort of project, and I wanted to explore the relationships between, it was the Green Ban movement that the Builders Labourers Federation kicked off in Sydney, and I, was just fascinated in that capacity of people to act collectively and bring about a good change for an area. So that was the bans on the Woolloomooloo area. And Keith was fabulous because he had, he'd been involved in so many movements and activities. He goes, that's fine, I'll get, I'll ring Jack Mundy up and see if he'll, come and do an interview with you. And I went, he goes, it'll probably cost you, you might need to give him a long neck beer bottle. And he tied us up and we whipped out to Croydon, and, I got to sit down with the man that really sort of kick-started a whole movement that saved the entire heritage of the Woolloomooloo district in Sydney now. So it was, was a tremendous thing for a young, woman, and and I immersed myself in the whole building industry culture at the time, which I've got to tell you isn't still to this day particularly women friendly, but I was very well, treated and regarded in that project. And I, Keith, again in that area, I remember going and complaining. We had this tradition at Wesley of a high tea, they called it, a formal dinner, that's right. And it was every Monday night, and we had to dress in academic gown, and we went into this big room, and it sort of, looked like a set of Harry Potter or something with this, very kind of old Oxford style kind of arrangement. And they had a series of guest speakers, and, I mean, they must, on reflection, I must have just seemed like such an uppity 17-year-old. And I remember going and saying, I want to see different kinds of speakers, and Keith challenged me then and just said, right, well, who, and that was when he rang Pat O'Shane, who was the first Aboriginal woman, judge in Sydney at the time, and got her in, and there was another guy who's, it's unforgivable, I can't remember his name, but he ran it was called the Bugger Up campaign, and it was the guy that graffitied over the big billboards, which was, a wonderful, again, an inspiring speaker, although I hadn't realised he was vegan, and our college was like completely unprepared for that. So fortunately he bought an avocado in a brown paper bag, which was his dinner at the high tea. But
so there was a bit of the radical going on for you right from the outset at uni.
I think it was a time, it was. It was. There was a very strong anti-nuclear movement at the time as well. Again, I was at college with Helen Caldecott's daughter and son at the time, so we were very involved in a lot of the anti-nuclear disarmament. And, you know, as a parliamentarian, I've again joined the worldwide group of parliamentarians now who continue to work on nuclear disarmament at an international level now. So some things, you know, you think, wow, that's been a few decades now, but it's always worth fighting. So, and the other thing that really, in those early days, again at university, was an exposure to for me then, the anti-apartheid movement. So, you know, Mandela was still in prison, and that was, you know, something else that I kind of knew in my bones. I started trying to learn more about that because I knew there was something that really, really horrified me about that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So you went through uni. At the end of that...
Oh, I didn't go through uni.
You didn't go through
uni? I
uni?
did 2 years, and I thought I'd have a year off, which turned into 5 years off. And then eventually went back to uni and just fell in love with it.
And was this the period of great walkabout, or?
It was. Mm-hmm. It was. I had a very. I don't know if it would still happen these days because universities are quite different kinds of places. But I had a very wise tutor. I was doing at Sydney Uni, anthropology was divided into two kind of streams. You did social, cultural anthropology, and you did prehistory, which was really archaeology. And I was doing both streams. My tutor from the archaeology side, who I now regard as a very wise man, but at the time I thought was very cheeky, pulled me aside and basically gave me a big dressing down and said, you know, I expect much more from you, and, you know, you're having a good time and, you know, dilly-dallying around, and you really need to sort of, you know, get your act together. Gave me about 12 books, all novels, all non-fiction books, and sent me away to read them, and just said, I don't want to see you until you're ready to be a serious scholar again, you know. And it took me a long time to come around. As I said, it was about 5 years before I came back to university.
Did you read the books?
I did. They were all V.S. Nepal, lots of Indian writers who I'd never sort of come across before. And it was, you know, and Kerouac, or the Beat Generation writers, all this. I'm not quite sure what message he was sending me because it sent me on the road for a long time then.
Well, this suggests a tangent here. What books shape your thinking?
I guess I read lots of. I started reading a lot of Australian fiction at that point. After I realised I'd been sort of, you know, I spent a lot of time at university reading, you know, reference and non-fictional material, which I adore. But I did learn a lesson then about the need to, you know, that there was something that creative writers give you that, you know, is difficult to replace, or that other people don't. You know, the capacity to see the world in a fundamentally different light at times, and I just love it when I was just thinking. I was just in Sydney recently, and I remember reading one of Ruth Park's Sydney books where she talks about the very early colonial contact period of Sydney, and discovering the freshwater streams that travelled along Pitt Street, and there are little pockets of evidence now. If you walked around Sydney and you learnt how to look again, you would be able to see how that pattern of colonial settlement kind of takes place. And I think, for me, that's the importance of reading fiction, is that sometimes it's a little like just kind of wiping your eyes and seeing anew again. And so you know, I'm a huge Tim Winton fan. I just think he's probably one of Australia's best storytellers at the moment. You know, it's been a long time since we had someone that could do a yarn like Tim, and I think that he's got really, really interesting observations to make, you know. but then my work in Indigenous communities kind of made me alive into an oral tradition that's not, well, until very recently, you know, not really a recorded sort of history or a recorded language. And that comes from, I think my family are pretty good storytellers. So there's a good line of them there.
So you've mentioned the Indigenous connection, but you went bush for a while.
I did. I came back to Newcastle after I did my second year of uni and was taking the 1 year off. I came back and my parents were living out on the lake at the time. BHP had just retrenched 5,000 workers. I was lining up at the CES, as it was called in those days, with, you know, every other middle-aged man in Newcastle now looking for work. And I just thought, oh, you know, this is like too depressing for words. And I literally, by complete accident, I think, because, you know, the men were all huddled around trying to get, you used to go and look at job boards. I don't know if anyone remembers this style, but the only job board that wasn't, you know, completely overwhelmed by people was the interstate job board, which is where I found myself. There was a job being advertised in the Northern Territory for a domestic gardener. Anyway, I don't know that I even knew what a domestic gardener was, but I thought, well, I read the little card and it said something about, you know, cleaning and you know, gardening or something, and I thought, I'm sure I could do that, you know. So I went to you took the card off the board and you went over to the CES officer, and she rang up, and I had no idea, but I was on the phone having a job interview before I knew what was going on, and the woman at the end of the phone who had this quite sort of strong German accent said to me at the end of the phone call, "So when can you get here?" And that was the job interview. So I remember going home to my parents saying, "I got a job." "Oh, great." I said, "Where is it?" "I was somewhere north of Tennant Creek, I think." And and I remember my father taking me out into the airport, which was out at Pelican in those days, and sort of, you know, like saying goodbye to me and saying, "Well, girl, I think you better keep your wits about you."
Had you ever been to the top end before?
Well, we'd lived in Darwin as a
Okay.
child, you know, in Larrakia Barracks, so I was very young and I was in a kind of, you know, army quarters, so no, didn't really have much memory of Tennant Creek, certainly. And all I knew is that I was going out onto one of the big Vesti properties, and anybody that understands, you know, cattle stations in Australia will know what that sort of rings. So there was only Helen Springs, which was the station I was about to embark on my cattle career on, and Wave Hill, of course, were the two owned by Vesti. And I remember arriving at the the Tennant Creek airport, which was really, you know, kind of just a big corrugated shed, and this guy coming sort of up to me and saying, pulling out his hand and going, "Stretch is the name, you better chuck your swag on the back of the car," as I had to arrive with the swag, and that was my one bit of equipment. And he said, "Well, we're going to go and get our supplies because we won't be back in town for 6 weeks." So, okay. And that was the start of my life on a cattle station. You know, I got there, the manager's wife, who was a German woman who was then, you know, living there, had instructed me as to my duties, and I had to clean the men's quarters, and the gardening really was about keeping bindis out of a very small patch of green grass that grew around the manager's house. The rest of the place was red dust, of course, so it was quite bizarre, and it was an introduction into what I can only imagine is like what serfdom lifestyles were. So you had a very structured environment of, you know, the single men's quarters down there, the governess lived up here, The manager's house was the big house, as we all called it, lived up there. There was a kind of, bough shed smoko area where we could all come together in the middle, but, none of these things actually ever connected up to each other at any given time. I'd been working around the homestead for some time, and I knew that I probably wasn't going to last. There probably wasn't going to be enough in the bindi weeding to hold me if I didn't find a new challenge while I was there. So Des, the manager, I badgered him to go out into the stock camp. And he goes, nope, we don't have women in the stock camp. You're not going out there. And so it was quite fortuitous that most of the men he employed, once they went to town, would not return. So there would be various sort of waves of non-returning kind of workers. The Aboriginal workforce remained and they were local, but there was a steady stream of fellas that would come and go. And so he was short-staffed and utterly desperate, which is the only way I got my gig in this. And I could ride a horse. That was my only saving grace.
How'd you learnt that?
I was, like a lot of young girls, quite horse mad. I badgered my mother since I could talk about trying to get a horse, and she was very smart, probably. She said, well, if you want a horse, you're going to have to go and get yourself a job working with horses. You're going to have to go and show, understand that you can look after a horse. So I managed to get a job with in an all-female stables for race horses in Bermagui on the south coast.
Great preparation for remote Australia.
It was just extraordinary when I reflect on it. I mean, they were just the wildest women imaginable who, that was their life of doing these sort of race carnivals. And so they had a pony that was my responsibility. And I had to go up, every afternoon up to those stables, clean them out, feed the horses, get the water, and to do this for years and years, and to prove to my parents that I was a responsible child and could do this. And then, of course, we moved back to Newcastle. Lambton wasn't so conducive to the horses.
Okay. So you found yourself heading out to a stock camp eventually?
Yeah, I got, I am stubborn perhaps, I'm not sure, but... So I got my gig in the stock camp and loved it, and that was it. Like once I was there, I knew I was not going back into the homestead. So that was good. I was allowed to cut out the rest of my time in the stock camp, and once he realised that, well, she can ride, she can work. I had to learn a lot. I hadn't sort of been out camp drafting cattle before, so that was a whole new skill. Yeah.
And they bred them big up there too.
They did, and of course, because I was the only woman in the camp, they wanted me to do the stock camp cooking as well. So that was interesting.
Favourite recipes from that time?
My bread. Yeah, which I've got to say was absolutely learning on the run. I remember the head stockman.
That's a pretty major admission in Newcastle because there's some great bread here.
There is some great bread. I had never cooked in a camp oven before. I had never baked bread before, and I was suddenly in a camp with 16 men who eat meat 5 times a day, and the only other variation on the diet was bread. So if I got the bread wrong, that was 50% of our diet out. And the head stockman was yelling the recipe at me as he was like saddling up and about ready to draft 3,000 head of cattle. So it was like, I didn't have a whole lot of time to get it right or wrong. But anyway, I don't know, something, my mother actually comes from a line of bakers, so I don't know if there was something through osmosis that happened as a child, but I kind of knew about pounding yeast and letting it rise and knocking it back again. And so, but judging the temperature of coals in a fireplace was something I had to learn, and learn the hard way. There was a lot of burnt offerings for a while there.
That contrast of remote area Australia and being in the city, being in army bases, being here, that's obviously had a huge impact on what it means to you to be an Australian. Can you tell us a bit about that?
It does, and there's been experiences that have been just the most fantastic, as well as sometimes, you know, the most jolting wake-up calls. So the first time, you know, that was in the Territory when I first started working on cattle stations, and there were 3 of the Aboriginal guys that I worked with were actually from the Kimberley region, and I was, I don't know, 19, maybe 20 by this stage, and at the time I was on my way to India, and I was going to be, you know, working for 6 months on the cattle station, chuffing back over the Kimberleys, go out of Perth was the plan. I got to the Kimberley, into Fitzroy Crossing, where one of the fellas that I had been working with over in the Territory was from. And I arrived, and this was the only person I knew in Fitzroy Crossing, but he was now in the police lockup. So his sister, it would be like his cousin's sister, arrived at the roadhouse where I had got off a bus, you know, and Fitzroy Crossing's not a huge town, and it would be at least probably, you know, 85% Aboriginal township. So some, you know, young blonde stranger in town was pretty quickly known, and his cousin's sister arrived and said, you know, Robbie said you were probably coming, he's in the lockup. And I went, what the hell, you know, what's and I had done, at that point in my life, 1 year of law at university, and
which makes you a local lawyer.
Absolutely. Went to the lockup, and the police sergeant, you know, came out and said, no, there'd been a rodeo on earlier in that week, and, you know, anyway, anybody that's been around rodeo circles probably knows the picture from now, which is there's lots of drinking, lots of, you know, invariably fights break out, and anyway, this is what happened in the lockup. I said, well, how long are you in for? And he goes, 3 months. And I said, well, where's you know, what happened in court? Did you, you know, who's representing you? Oh, no. In WA in those days, a justice of the peace could still pass sentences. Okay, so there was a JP, and I've got to tell you, I was a JP for many moons. The idea that we'd be sitting around passing judgment of people is a little bit scary, but you know, and I got to know this man a lot over. Anyway, he basically, in the summary, his judgment for sentencing was, Roberty Bob, you're a bastard of a kid, and you're still a bastard. You can go away for 3 months. So excuse the language, but it's a true replication. And you know, I was outraged, thinking, oh, we can't have that. You know? And but it was I started to learn a little bit about WA legal systems and how to negotiate, which was became a very good skill to learn. But after I was this annoying visitor at the lockup each day, eventually the sort of, sergeant kind of said, oh, look, if you like, you can take them out for the daytime as long as you have them back for nighttime lockup, I said, okay, And then they have this other funny tradition in Western Australia in those days, which the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody was all about trying to address some of these issues, I might add. But the police in those days got paid by the number of prisoners in your lockup. You got a meal allowance. Okay, so you were providing meals, technically, but in a place like Fitzroy Crossing, what that means is that they get, most of those prisoners were in fact stockmen and, you know, highly skilled cattle workers, so they would get them to go out, kill their own meat, butcher it, bring it back in, and I'm pretty certain no money ever changed hands for this. So it was the irony of handing a prisoner a loaded rifle to go out and shoot cattle, which is ostensibly rustling someone else's. Like, you know, there's a tradition on cattle stations, you never kill your own either. You're always killing your neighbour's cattle, so to eat. And so, you know, this craziness would be going on, and I'd be thinking, what? You know, this is some legal system, you know. Anyway, that was a bit of an eye-opener, and then, of course, there were, that was in the, you know, mid-80s, and, you know, openly discriminatory practices were everywhere. You went to Fitzroy Crossing pub, and there was a bar for black people.
Yep.
And there were dogs waiting on the bar that I was allowed to walk into to make sure no black person crossed that path.
So you'd had the apartheid experience back at university, and now you're experiencing it
in my own country.
in your own country.
Which I hadn't known, like I really hadn't sort of appreciated that before.
But now you are in relationship with Indigenous people, probably in a different way from how you had experienced before. The relationship then between First Peoples and Second Peoples for you, was that beginning to change your view about what needed to happen in the country?
Yeah, I learnt a lot of valuable lessons about if you, like I knew as a young person, I mean, none of that sat comfortably with me. I knew that it didn't fit into, you know, a moral compass that I had for myself. But I had also observed a lot of people coming and going in Indigenous communities over time, doing or attempting to do lots of different things. And it became really clear that unless you and until you form a genuine partnership, that, you know, it's quite a pointless exercise.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what genuine partnership might mean?
It's a very time-consuming way to work, and I think that's why it doesn't happen a lot in Australia. So it takes a long time to get to know a community, and anybody would appreciate that if you had complete strangers coming into your household. You know, it takes a bit of time to understand how a household operates, and a community is no different. And I think that there are, Aboriginal people have over many generations had lots of government programs and non-government programs and ideas imposed, you know, without having much of a say there. So it's become my understanding of, I guess, community development and that later role of, I think Hamish referred to, you know, trying to secure funds to buy cattle stations because, again, in WA there was no form of land rights legislation. So the only way for you to return to traditional country in Western Australia, before the Mabo decision, of course, was to either get a an excision on a cattle station, which is 1 square kilometre, or if you could do it, raise funds to actually buy the pastoral lease, and which obviously was the much preferred option. And that was very much, that was part of the early outstations movement. I don't know if people have been involved in that at all, but, and so it is literally building a community from no infrastructure, nothing, from the bottom up. And so I think that's where I learnt about community, what we call community development, perhaps, and the need to, giving people the space to sort of take those lead roles as to how a community, even what's important, like I think we all had notions about, you need power, you need water, you need this and this, but they weren't always the first priorities. And giving people space to make those decisions, and that's what I meant about the sort of a genuine partnership where you are not always, you're there for certain sort of resources, and when it works well together, it's quite a phenomenal sight, actually.
So how do you see those kinds of partnerships or relationships developing now?
There are some great examples, again, back in Fitzroy Crossing, which is an area that I'm much more familiar with. The women in that valley certainly lead the charge, and for good reasons. There are many issues that have impacted on men in fundamentally different ways, and there are communities that you go to that there is a generation of Aboriginal men that is dead, and going to funerals on a weekly basis, and all of that sort of grief and hardship that people live. And it's been women who have just said, enough, we cannot do this anymore, and we're not going to let the next generation of young Bunuba men go through this. So they've made some pretty radical decisions and fought governments at every level really, really hard to get, sort of drinking restrictions in place. There was a controversial actual purchasing of the hotel so that they could control entirely the operations of that hotel and the way and the profits were to be used from the hotel. They've got a tremendous a family health sort of centre which runs in, which has, I guess, the courage to privilege a lot of Indigenous health practices and reclaim some of those spaces. So, for women in Fitzroy Crossing, when you're having your first baby, they made you go to Derby Hospital, which was, probably 300 kilometres away, and made you go like 6 weeks before the baby in case something happened, and that was about the most horrific sort of experience for most young women imaginable. So they all, got dragged over to Derby Hospital, and within days would have run back to the community, and then they go out bush into one of the outstations so they can't be found. So it kind of made sense that maybe we might look at some other kind of birthing practices that women might be a bit more comfortable with at home, and that's what a lot of those older women have done now, and have made it possible sort of to I guess convince certain sort of hospital and health workers that maybe having a baby isn't the most dangerous thing in life, and maybe they could stay closer to home to do that.
We've found in the church with frontier services working in a lot of remote areas like that, having midwives travel around the countryside has made a huge difference. But even now, a lot of those practices still resurface from time to time. So when you come across those kinds of stories now, you're in a very different position. You're no longer the person in the field who can't do as much about it. You're now sitting in federal parliament.
Yeah, I know, I still pinch myself on that one.
Yeah.
It's great. It's for me now trying to think about how, and I have been used to being that other person that goes to lobby your MP. I mean, it's in fact how I ended up, people would say to me, so how did you jump from anthropology into politics? And I said, well, it wasn't actually that big a jump because working in contemporary Aboriginal communities and societies is an intensely political space. But I remember one of the big changes was, of course, the High Court Mabo decision. So that came down when I was still working up in the Kimberley, and I was asked to assist on trying to explain through a series of bush meetings what this thing called native title at common law was. And so I was there sort of doing work with the Bunurong community. There are lots of, in the Fitzroy Valley, there are a lot of people who've come in from desert communities. The Bunurong people who I worked with are very much river people, but there are, half a dozen languages that people speak. English might be their fifth language. So trying to explain a High Court judgment to people with minimal contact with a common law system and multiple sort of challenges with linguistic barriers. I thought after day 3 that I was finally breaking through, okay, until at the end of that night, this old man that I'd worked with for, many years, and an incredibly astute old man, eventually came up to me and he goes, Sharon, he didn't call me, he had another name for me, and he sort of said, but I got to ask you, who is this fella Bill? Because we'd spent the whole days talking about these bills, bills coming to Parliament, bills going up here, bills. And he goes, this bloody fella, he's everywhere, Why, if he's so bloody important, he should front up and come and see us straight away, So, I kind of realised that there was still a bit more work to be done there, and maybe my explanation wasn't quite as clear as I had thought. And anyway, he was, eventually, we ended up bringing judges to him, and that was better. And then he insisted that they should wear full robes to country. He said, well, if I'm going to go visit someone else's country, I would be dressed appropriately. So that was, so anyway, sorry, I digress, because the native title, that was a big part of my role. I would come back to the university, and I came back into Newcastle at that point, and I remember going to see my then federal member and saying, I've got a proposal for a series of amendments to the Native Title Act. There are some issues, and I just kept hounding him. He probably thought, oh my God, can she just go away?
Were you a member of the party by then or not?
No, not at that stage. Okay. No. My father was, and I certainly had a long family sort of history, but no,
so an independent
I had
citizen.
been resisting joining, and but eventually, I drove my federal member, probably to distraction, and And he, at the time, just said to me, well, you know, basically, if you've got so many ideas, why don't you come and work on some policy for me?
Mm-hmm.
So I did, yeah. And then I remained working for MPs till last September. Mm.
Wow, that's huge.
So it was big. So I was very much used to, you know, knocking on the door and doing this sort of, you know, lobbying from the other side. I mean, lobbying's got a bad connotation these days, but it's advocating. And you
So
know,
then, standing for federal parliament, putting yourself out there, which is a very different scene from researching for other people or working on other people's campaigns. Now it's your name that's on the ticket. You're the person who fronts up in front of people. You're the person being judged all the time, sometimes targeted in different ways, sometimes supported. What motivates you to do it now?
fundamental, you know, belief that humans, when they act collectively together to do good things, can make a profound difference. And that continues to drive me. Like, I've seen it all through my life, and nothing, you know, has shaken that foundation, I guess. So, yes, you put yourself out there. That took a little bit of getting used to. Not so much, you know, I'm quite happy to talk, but it's I'd not taken on that sort of really front role in that field for some time, so that was a challenge. But it was thinking, well, you know, I've been given an extraordinary opportunity and trust. You know, I'm very happy to come back to that, but extraordinary trust to sort of use that very privileged platform of a position in Parliament, hopefully to do good things in my community. And I know that probably sounds quite sort of Pollyanna-ish in these days, but it's what drives me.
There's a degree to which you need that Pollyanna bit to just front up every day, though, isn't there?
There is. Look, people on the whole are generally pretty fantastic. You know, I get to represent a fantastic community of Newcastle, and you know, people are grounded in Newcastle, which I really appreciate. People will come up and tell me if I'm doing all right on something or other. You know, I had a great meeting in Beresfield today, and this guy sort of said to me, well, you know, it's good. I want to say something like, you know, we've been seeing lots of you up here, you know, and we like that, you know, we need you to, people want to have a sense that
you're here.
You're there, you know, you're accessible.
Which is hard, because how many days do you actually have to spend in Canberra?
Well, I'm 30 weeks almost in Canberra.
So to try then to balance being seen here, as well as actually have some home time.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm pretty skilled these days that when you have your downtime,
Do it, yeah.
you just do it. You don't spend a day winding down or something. You know, if you've got the day off, you've just got to chill straight up.
Into
That's
it.
into it. And so
are there hobbies that you get into on your
it's
time
a great
out?
skill. Yeah, look, I try to read, you know, for pleasure is one thing, but increasingly now I'm finding the need to move. So whether it's going for a walk or going for a swim, I actually need to physically do something because I don't get to do as much physical exercise as I would like.
Well,
and
I think Leonie and I both have tricycles, and that's a great thing to do around here. So. Now, there's been quite a lot of public interest in these conversations, and one of the major reasons has been because of the public perception now that in some ways politics or politicians have been tainted as we've uncovered more and more questions through ICAC. Now that's been around for a really long time. That's been not restricted to any single party. Both leaders from all over the place have talked about various ethical standards and stances that their parties will take. But I wanted to ask you about your personal sense of, do you have your own code of ethics that you live by that many of us would understand that there are those things that you are passionate about, which sometimes come into conflict with the things that are required of you. So how do you deal with your personal ethics?
For me, it's sort of, this might sound a little bit family-like, but it's, as a child, the thing that my father always did to us, which drove me crazy at the time, was, you know, when we'd be going out something, he said, I'm the little bird on your shoulder. And I've got to tell you, that is with me for life. And so there are tests that I think about, you know, how would this pass the kind of family test, you
There's
know?
like conscience.
Yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
always there. And I know that there are, and the other thing for me is I'm very conscious of the fact that there is, you know, so much dirt and murkiness in the world of politics, and it's very much on show at the moment. Somebody, you know, thought I'd be overjoyed at the downfall of the Liberal Premier, Barry O'Farrell, the other week. And I've got to tell you, I don't find any joy in that whatsoever. I mean, yes, we come from very different political parties, you know. I don't have a lot of ideologies in common, but it gives me nothing but sadness to see the demise of a democratic structure that is compounding a sense of betrayal in my community. And there's an enormous amount of work to be done to really rebuild trust for people whose contacts, and the only way that I can see that actually happening is to have genuine personal relationships with your community. So
I guess in a sense, and I guess this is by way of encouragement, the church faces the same kind of thing.
yeah,
There's, while there's ICAC at the moment for politicians, there's a Royal Commission that has really uncovered terrible things as far as the church is concerned. And that sense of trying to rebuild relationships, I guess, is part of what evenings like this are about. Starting to tell stories and hear stories that enable us to develop trusting relationships with one another. One last question that I have before we start finding out what some other people might also want to ask is, what would you say to the church and to other religious institutions about what kind of contributions we can make in terms of supporting an ethical and value-driven society? How can we help build the community that we're in?
and doing things like you're doing tonight is a great start. So you really should be congratulated for that. I think reaching out and always trying to be inclusive in a community, I know that that's, for me, something that, you know, I try to use as a guiding principle all the time about when I'm, you know, building, you know, working on projects in the community is, you know, does everyone have an opportunity to benefit from this, or is this exclusive in some way, you know? And if it is exclusive in some way, your job is to make it less so. There is, you know, people who don't feel like they have a place, or they don't feel like they belong, that they're not welcomed. There's nothing more demoralising in a community, I think. So everybody deserves to have a place. Everybody deserves to have a safe place in a community too, and that's what that churches and people like me need to, redouble our efforts and recommit to all the time. So, and it's a big challenge. Sometimes, I still catch myself out thinking, that whether somebody's been left out at some point. And, it's sometimes confronting and frequently challenging.
And that's quite difficult when you're always having to focus on the popular agenda as well.
And leadership isn't always about taking the most popular path. And sometimes you've just got to take that, like I know that I've taken some moral positions on a range of issues that are, that some people in my community are going to agree with and some aren't, and I know that. But I try to be very upfront about that and make clear my position and where I'm coming from. So I'm somebody who has fought against discrimination for pretty much most of my adult life. So when I see discriminatory practices in place, I won't remain silent on it, and I don't stop. So sometimes, that's people come at those, arrive at those places and decisions at different times in their lives, I guess. But, and I guess that for me, the issue of marriage equality is the one that really sort of, I was asked a lot about before I stood for the election. So I made very, very clear that that's the prism in which I look at that, and I just think, for me, this is a discriminatory practice now. And so yes, when asked, would I support marriage equality, I have no qualms in doing so. And I am quite comfortable about explaining my reasons to people, And I get some people that are pretty outraged about that.
Sure.
But I hope that honesty and that, perhaps getting to know me a bit, that they may sort of accept that whilst we could have a different opinion on that issue, maybe some others too, but there's enough sort of common ground there for us to work together and out of a genuine common, love for our respective communities. It's the thing that anthropology ironically really taught me from a very, young age, was in all the time that you're studying cultural difference and looking and trying to learn about otherness, so it's really all the time learning about learning much more about yourself than you do about other people. Yeah. And eventually, the whole purpose of that sort of endeavour is to, in fact, uncover a common humanity. And, that's, for me, something that remains sort of, that I always will search for. What is that common ground there? So...
Well, Sharon, I think tonight you've given us a real chance to see our common humanity with you and the way in which you've shared very openly with us this evening. I'd invite our audience now to take a few moments to converse with each other, and perhaps if anybody has some questions, to place them in the bowl up the back, and we will reconvene in about 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
As well as possible. There are quite a few, and some of them I'm going to try to combine. As we've advertised for the evening, one of the major purposes for this evening was to explore ethics and values with our civic leaders. And so I'm going to try to reframe some of the questions in those terms. One of the things that we did also make very clear to our guests for each of the coming occasions is that we're not trying to just get a party line about political responses to particular issues, but trying to look behind that to the values and ethics that shape some of those things. So, in that spirit, one of the major things that has come up here in terms of questions is around children in detention in particular, and refugee and asylum seekers in the country. One of the questions frames that in terms of how do we address issues like that when we come from a sense of common humanity. The other thing that has cropped up with those questions is the offer from the Uniting Church to house any children currently in detention and to care for them, and hoping that that might one day lead to some ways forward. So how do you address issues like that? Obviously you come out in the end with a party policy, but there's a lot of ethical dilemmas to work through on your way through. So how do you address that?
It's part of the great new challenge for me. There obviously were policies taken to an election. Labor lost government, and so I regard that as an opportunity to rethink, you know, to reconnect with our communities and to broaden the ways in which we might develop some policies for the future. So I am actually, you know, a little more optimistic than maybe some others. I am, you know, part of a group of people that are trying to extend those conversations, and I take seriously that, you know, there is a huge role for, particularly for churches in this space, but to all the community groups that come and meet with me on this issue in particular. You know, I've just met with both my local and national Amnesty International groups who've you know, brought down a report on Manus Island, and that the challenge that I put to those groups, like I put to myself, is we actually have to not talk to each other. That seems to be a bit of a problem. I tend to go to meetings that will have the same kinds of faces telling me about, you know, the need for a change and what I think the challenge is in order to, you know, there's no surer way than to move political parties when there is a big community swell going on. So I think that trying to, you know, and again, it fits with a life philosophy that I have about trying to reach out and bring those people sort of in, including them in a discussion that they have felt previously pretty excluded from, or are feeling, you know, or just downright really cross about things, you know. I've had a little life experience of bringing, when the WIC decision came down, and there was a decision then that, you know, we had to find ways to have coexisting ownership and title on the same patch of land. I was working for Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation in those days, and I was sent into central Queensland to work with the pastoralists. Now, I don't know if anyone can remember that scene back there, but it was kind of, you know, my knees were knocking. But what I knew is that if I could get the traditional owners and the pastoralists to sit at the same table, that they would stop demonising each other, and we would end up with a land use agreement that everyone could live with. And that's exactly what happened. It took a lot of hard work, and I'm not pretending it happened overnight, but it's actually bringing people who don't otherwise have lots to do with each other, that think there are fears they have fears and anxieties about the issues and finding ways to include those people in the conversation.
You use an interesting term there, demonise, which in some ways is dehumanise, and you talked earlier about a common humanity and trying to find that.
Yep.
Yeah.
You can always find common ground. That's my mantra. You will always find it if you try. And so I would just encourage, it can seem like a long way off, and I actually don't have a crystal ball. I've got to tell you, sitting in the Parliament, it doesn't feel like we're in any close space of finding a mechanism to have an informed national discussion. It's not, something that I can see just sort of waiting for us to grab just there. But I think that I would encourage people to take leadership in their own communities.
Well, by way of linking into the ethics conversation and giving you forewarning, perhaps, one of the reasons why Anglican, Catholic and Uniting Church ministers are getting arrested at the moment is because they're having pray-ins in the waiting rooms of various members' offices around the country. And it's under the code of ethics for each of those different groups that ministers can still hold clerical placement if they're arrested for civil disobedience, but that's about the only one. So that's the ethics and values kind of area again. How do you deal then with conflicts between party lines and your own personal beliefs?
Yeah. There are structures within, I can only obviously talk for the Labor Party. There are structures within the party where you've got space to thrash it out. And I guess it's my belief that that's my responsibility to be able to mount as strong a case as possible through those mechanisms. I choose very consciously to work within a party structure, and again, because there are many. I hear people sort of make comments all the time about, well, God, you can't tell the difference, it's the same, blah, blah. I know and experience an enormous difference, which is why I choose to be a member of the Labor Party. But the challenge for me is to bring a caucus room around to that sort of point of view. And you've got to accept that everyone's kind of trying that. It's not, I wouldn't imagine, I wouldn't, pretend otherwise. I don't see that that's an easy task by any means, and there are people coming from very different points of view. But in a way, it's a bit like dealing with your communities. People do present with diverse opinions, and it's important to have a respectful space where you can have that thrashing out. But at the end of the day, when there's a decision made on a party line, then there has been a policy with, it's a long tradition within the Labor Party that there are binding sort of decisions. We're having an interesting discussion about that in itself at the moment, and there may be some sort of changes there. But I don't think you should ever lose sight of the communities that you represent, and continue to articulate. I come from a very well-informed community on a whole range of issues.
Do you think that there may be a movement towards more conscience votes on some issues?
Yeah, I think there will be. And I think, I find it a challenge. It's a much bigger challenge than just for one political party, because even though...
It's the whole system.
Yeah, indeed. So there, you tend to see people vote party lines, whether or not they have a binding caucus decision rule or not. So it's about, whether those spaces, I think you will see political parties undergo quite a bit of change, and you know, for me, I think there are many welcome possibilities. It's early days, but I think it's the one good thing to come out of an otherwise, you know, bloody and unedifying process is that it does open up a window for change, and you should grab those opportunities with both hands and, you know, and go for it. So that's what I know a lot of members within the party that I belong to are certainly doing. So it's really trying to find new democratic ways within a democratic party to do things.
That phrase, a sometimes bloody and unedifying process, I guess was one of the reasons why you weren't originally allowed to go to the stock camp in the early days. Some people would have said that certainly in state parliament, the bear pit, and now in federal parliament, which can be just as feisty and aggressive, that it's not an easy place for women. One of the questions raised tonight has been referencing yesterday's Sydney Morning Herald that noted how difficult it can be for women as councillors or as mayors of places, and you've experienced that yourself. And now in federal politics, we have talked at length as a community about the impact that having a female Prime Minister had on the country, and the treatment of Julia Gillard in particular had a lot of discussion following her removal from office as well, about how women get treated in politics. We haven't raised that earlier in the conversation tonight, but obviously it's there.
Yeah. You get yourself great women mentors. I'm lucky I'm in a party with some quite significant, strong women leaders. I have a weekly meeting session with Tanya Plebisek, the deputy leader of my party, Senator Penny Wong, who leads our Senate, contingency. So it's not like I don't have some pretty good role models, and I was in fact having a discussion with Jude just a little earlier on about some women parliamentarians from the Pacific that had come to Canberra and were asking for women parliamentarians from Australia to be willing to be in a partnership relationship with them, so that they had somebody to kind of contact, talk issues through, and be a support network for each other. And if you think we have it tough in Australia, you want to try being a woman in some of these parliaments. So, a woman. Yeah. So, I think that we've got a long way to go in Australia, and that just means there's more work to be done, for me. But I think that I know that there have been some great steps, and there are some important steps have been taken, that there are some very good women role models, and I'm sure in every party, obviously I hang out with the Labor women more so, but and it's important for us nationally and internationally to have those links to encourage women to participate fully in the sort of democratic decision making in their nations. There are such young sort of democracies that are very ill-equipped at dealing with having, even having structures in place that would enable women to stand for office in the first place.
This particular community here hosted 4 women leaders from the Tuvalu Islands for a visit year before last, and we talked at length about the influence or impact women can or can't have in social development in different places in the Pacific, and those those mentoring relationships that you've experienced are some that are most welcome in the Pacific, I believe. So.
And, you know, the good news is that the meeting that I attended was a good, strong, cross-party representation of women who, like me, are happy to put their hand up and say, you know, I'll partner with one of those women and work together.
Several of the questions are about specific policy issues in this region. I'm probably not going to go into all of those because I think they're probably better addressed directly to your office. But one of them asks, what do you think the greatest social justice issues are before us today?
Wow, housing.
Housing?
It's been really worrying me for some time. I'm seeing increased numbers of people who just are unable to afford housing. You know, and whether that's not buying into a market, it's about even trying to, you know, rent the most modest of places. So I'm seeing increased pressure on community groups to feed and house people from communities. I observe governments increasingly stepping back from any responsibility for housing citizens. So, and that's, you know, I'm not slinging that one way or another. I think we've seen respective consecutive governments at a state level in particular back off from, you know, investing into housing stock.
Well, I guess that's one of the next questions that does relate with one of these. When you have crossover issues that are federal policy but live their way out or work their way out in a local state setting, what kind of processes do you go through, or how can you work through those? So, for example, in the Hunter area or in Newcastle in particular, Newcastle inner city development, how can you deal with housing issues here?
You're right, I don't have a direct jurisdiction. Often the federal government is not building that housing, but there are important national partnerships and funding arrangements in place for housing. So,
and even the infrastructure, transport, etc.
Yeah. So one of the, I had a number of my homeless housing groups come to see me in the last session of Parliament and said, we don't have any funding past the 30th of June. So that means they were beginning to lose staff already because, you know, people need some kind of security in employment. This is something I spoke in Parliament about, and there was, you know, a good community campaign run by the homeless organisations, and, you know, there's been a stay of execution, well, what I call a stay of execution, because there's a 12-month funding arrangement now in place to sort of tide over whilst people plan what might happen, you know. So it's, I think the national government does have that capacity to enter into the big, you know, Commonwealth heads of government agreements that help direct a policy outcome on the ground. And they traditionally do that through funneling money, you know. That's how it works. And then the states are delivering services on the ground. I think that when people typically come to see their Member of Parliament about an issue, they rarely actually divide the world up into local, state and federal. And so they don't really give a damn that I'm the federal member.
Just do something.
Exactly, this is just do something. And they feel like they've been often by the time someone comes to see, they've been through a lot of different levels.
So there's a role then as public advocate. Yeah.
It is, and it's saying, all right, you know, like I don't have direct responsibility for this, but you know what? I can actually make a formal representation on your behalf to the state minister about this, or to, you know, fortunately I had a background in local government, so I can navigate my way around most local government sort of matters as well. And really sometimes it's about trying to empower somebody else about how they might learn to navigate their way around that too. And people will be endlessly frustrated with, you know, council on any number of issues, and you can say, well, you know that you have some elected councillors as well. And if you don't, you know, there's an administrative arm to council, there's an elected arm, and maybe you've got to take your argument up with some of those elected people as well. And giving people some tools to do that.
That's a lovely lead-in to remind people that our next conversation we will be talking with Tim Owen, and that will be on June the 4th. The interviewer that evening will actually be John Cleary from the ABC, and it gives us a little reminder that there are different levels of government. It is appropriate for us to get to know all of our different civic leaders. So one final question from the floor is, the media emphasises when politicians are religious, often negatively. How can religious groups counter that perception of hypocrisy?
Counter the perception of hypocrisy.
Well, particularly when politicians fall back on religious beliefs or using religion as one of the swords, or...
Okay, yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm not sure how you get to control the way people behave in public life, except that I would just, you know, everybody should try and lead by example themselves. And so I think that it's pretty weak to actually, if you have a failing, to somehow kind of, you know, fob that off onto someone else or an organisation or whatever. I don't even know if failing is the right word in that context, but you've got to, if you're going to make a stand, you've got to have the conviction to you know, to own it. It's no one else. It's
yours.
It's yours, and you know, that's your role and responsibility to kind of own that now, and that's why you ideally want people to make good choices in the first place, because that's what you want to be owning and advocating, you know, and pushing the case for. So I don't know that I think that the church groups that I get to work with in Newcastle are often already either very engaged in their communities, or they're searching for ways to do that better. And you know, there are some of our faith-based organisations here who are going through a very difficult time now, and you know, I can relate to that. I see political parties going through that same sort of process. So, but as I say to, you know, my own rank and file membership of Labor Party, this is an opportunity. You know, this is really an opportunity we need to grab, because this is the time you make changes and you put in place things to make sure you're never going to end up in that space again, or the best you can.
Absolutely.
You know? So I would say that to all of the faith-based organisations in Newcastle, you know, it's an opportunity to really sort of re-engage with your communities, and you know, that connection is vital. I mean, I just see the amazing work that, you know, you, and every night of the week I have got church-based groups feeding people in Newcastle. Every night of the week. Then,
and some of the volunteers are here tonight as well. So,
and you know what? And then I see you in the morning feeding the kids at school. So I guess for what it's worth, I see that and I acknowledge that. And that's, I think, a great service in our community. And if that is part of the role of churches, which I believe it is to serve in our community, then, you know, that's a tremendous contribution. And you know, maybe not everybody sees it all the time, but nobody rarely does this kind of work to be in it for the glory. So, but you know, there's a level that I feel sad that there is so much need in my community, but I'm enormously proud that I have people that stand up and you know, and take on those roles as they're needed, you know. So I'm probably the luckiest woman in this nation because I get to sit in Parliament representing this community.
well, on that note, you'll notice that behind you up there is a banner that says "Serving Our Community." We've had a wonderful experience this evening of hearing you, Sharon Claydon, and my personal thanks. And I'd invite Leonie to come up and offer our community's thanks to you.
Oh, thanks.
I'd love to. Thank you, Sharon, for this evening. It's been, well, informative is too dull a word to sort of say. Inspirational, I think. No, I believe so. And I would like to present you with this. And the plant as well, but we won't make you carry that at this particular stage. So I would ask everybody to show your appreciation for this evening with the round
Thank
of
you.
applause.
Thank you. Thank you. You've, I'm going to unplug now, but I'm going to be around for a little while if you need to catch me. Okay? Thank you.